The official naval archives of the Pacific Theater are a masterpiece of bureaucratic fiction. They tell a sanitized story of overwhelming fleet bombardments and heroic marine beach landings, completely scrubbing away the terrifying, blood-soaked truth of what actually happened on the rotting, storm-battered wooden piers of the supply lines. Imagine being drafted into the absolute edge of the known world, surviving a grueling, disease-ridden journey across the Pacific Ocean, only to be handed a heavy iron cargo hook instead of an armor-piercing rifle. In the blistering, suffocating late autumn of 1943, deep within a treacherous, deep-water port facility in the Solomon Islands, this was not a philosophical debate about military equality. It was the agonizing, daily reality for the men of the 234th Port Battalion. They were a segregated, entirely African-American unit of military stevedores, winch operators, crane riggers, and dock workers. In the rigidly prejudiced United States military machine, they were explicitly classified as a strictly non-combat, disposable labor pool. They were not issued heavy anti-tank guns, bazookas, or armored half-tracks. They were equipped with colossal, steam-powered dockside gantry cranes, massive braided steel hawsers, and miles of heavy iron anchor chains. They were the invisible, sweat-drenched circulatory system of the island hopping campaign, expected to silently plunge their hands into the blistering heat and torrential rains to unload the millions of tons of high-explosive ammunition and raw steel that kept the war machine moving, absorbing the absolute worst of the equatorial elements and enemy sniper fire while the elite white Marine divisions pushed forward to claim the medals. Before we walk out onto the swaying, rain-swept timber of the deep-water pier with these forgotten titans of the dockyard, I need to know who is holding the seawall with us today. These men physically lifted the burden of the entire Pacific War on their broken backs in absolute darkness, and in return, they were systemically erased from the history books. Whether you are watching this from a skyscraper in Tokyo, a crowded street in Detroit, or a quiet rural town thousands of miles from the ocean, drop your city in the comments right now. Let us map out our own global battalion in honor of the men the establishment intentionally left to drown in the storm. The profound tragedy of the 234th Port Battalion was born from a catastrophic, deeply arrogant intelligence failure by the Allied Naval Command. Miles away from the suffocating, rain-choked horror of the commercial pier, the American admirals had confidently declared the outer coral reefs entirely impassable to enemy naval forces. They had ordered the segregated stevedores to maintain continuous, 24-hour offloading operations on a massive, 1,000-foot concrete and timber pier extending deep into the black water, even as a catastrophic, Category 4 tropical typhoon began to batter the island. The black crane operators spent 48 agonizing hours in the howling, 100-mile-per-hour winds, wrestling with colossal swinging cargo nets and heavy iron pallets under the relentless freezing rain, successfully keeping the logistical arteries open. But the reality of the Pacific Naval War was deeply unforgiving, and the Imperial Japanese Navy had secretly adapted to the treacherous geography. Deep within the blinding, violently churning black storm surge of the outer reef, an elite, highly mechanized vanguard of the Japanese Special Naval Landing Forces, supported by a terrifying column of massive, experimental amphibious assault tanks, had entirely bypassed the main American naval blockades by utilizing the high tide of the typhoon. They were crawling silently out of the surf, preparing to launch a devastating surprise assault directly down the 1,000-foot pier to capture the deep-water port and shatter the Allied supply lines. Up on the high concrete seawall overlooking the docks, a group of white American commanding officers and logistics captains had just arrived in pristine staff cars to inspect the facility. When they looked through their polished brass binoculars and saw the rapidly advancing wave of elite Japanese armor pouring out of the ocean spray, the local command structure entirely and instantly collapsed into a cowardly panic. The officers realized the sheer scale of the ambush and immediately boarded the last operational naval destroyer docked at the adjacent inlet, preparing to flee into the open ocean to save their own lives. As the massive warship's engines roared to life and detached from the moorings, the commanding colonel sent a final, frantically typed radio transmission to the segregated stevedores who were still standing on the violently swaying, storm-battered planks of the main pier. The message was sterile, brief, and completely devoid of any human empathy. The battalion of the 234th was ordered to remain on the hostile dock. They were explicitly instructed to drop their heavy iron cargo hooks, pick up their light standard issue M1 carbines, and physically barricade the massive pier with their own bodies and wooden supply crates to prevent the Japanese armor from reaching the shoreline. There was no promise of an armored extraction. There was no timeline for heavy naval artillery support. The command simply weighed the lives of 200 black dockworkers against the time it would take to secure their own cowardly retreat, and crossed the men out with a red pencil. They were biologically cheap, entirely expendable speed bumps, left behind to be slaughtered in the typhoon while the officers sped away to the safety of the open sea. Panic, raw, suffocating, and completely mathematically justified, began to tear through the ranks of the abandoned port battalion. The massive, exposed deep water pier was rapidly transforming into an inescapable, storm-swept slaughterhouse. The wooden planks were already beginning to rhythmically tremble beneath their soaked boots, vibrating with the distant, terrifying mechanical thunder of the advancing amphibious tanks rolling out of the surf. The men of the 234th were trapped on a narrow strip of wood and concrete surrounded by violently churning black water. They had no heavy anti-tank weapons, no explosives, and their standard issue rifles were absolutely useless against hardened steel armor. It was a mathematical death sentence. The young men, drafted from the segregated neighborhoods of Chicago and the bustling, brutal shipyards of Baltimore, fell to their knees in the freezing, rain-choked wind, hiding behind pathetic stacks of wooden ammunition crates, praying to a god that seemed utterly absent from this cursed Pacific island. But standing in the absolute center of the loading zone, entirely ignoring the chaotic, terrifying roar of the approaching armor and the howling storm, was First Sergeant Isaac Winch Carter. He was a colossal, broad-shouldered man in his late 50s, his heavy canvas uniform completely soaked and permanently stained with thick marine grease and saltwater rust. Before the war, Isaac had not learned physics from an Ivy League textbook or a pristine naval engineering academy. He was a master crane rigger and a heavy loadmaster who had spent decades working high above the brutal, unforgiving concrete piers of the Brooklyn Navy Yard. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life manipulating the terrifying, uncompromising physical laws of immense suspended payloads, extreme tensile strain, and raw pendulum momentum. He did not look at the advancing Japanese armor and see an unbeatable military fortress. And he did not look at the storm-swept pier and see an inescapable grave. He looked up at the colossal, 5-story tall steam-powered gantry crane towering over the center of the dock. He looked at the heavy, braided steel lifting cables and the massive iron cargo nets designed to hoist hundreds of tons of raw material. The officers who had fled expected these men to die cowering behind wooden boxes, fighting hopelessly with rifles against tank shells. But they had completely forgotten what these men actually did for a living. They were not just soldiers, they were the absolute, undisputed masters of extreme payload kinetics. Listen to me. Isaac roared, his deep, gravelly voice slicing cleanly through the howling typhoon winds and the paralyzing terror of his men. His massive hands gripped a heavy, forged iron marlinspike. The brass ran away because they think we are nothing but cargo rats. They think we do not know how to fight because they abandoned us in the storm. But we do not need their artillery. We are the men who lift the world, and we know exactly how to drop it. Isaac pointed his heavy, grease-stained finger directly at the massive piles of high-density iron ship ballast and thousands of feet of heavy anchor chains sitting on the dock. We are going to turn this entire pier into the biggest, heaviest kinetic pendulum the world has ever seen. Drop your rifles. Grab every heavy wrench, every steel locking carabiner, and fire up that main steam boiler. We are not going to shoot those tanks. We are going to sweep them entirely into the sea. The 200 abandoned dockworkers instantly transformed from a panicked, forgotten labor pool into a frantic, blindingly efficient forge of absolute battlefield survival. The sheer, agonizing terror that had paralyzed them minutes before was entirely burned away, replaced by a cold, calculating, and terrifyingly focused mechanical rage. They were fighting for their fundamental right to exist, wielding the exact heavy industrial equipment the military establishment had used to humiliate them. They did not try to dig shallow trenches into the concrete to hide from the incoming shells. They waded directly into the freezing, rain-swept center of the pier, moving with the synchronized, rhythmic perfection of men who had spent years fighting the massive, grueling weights of the shipping industry. Under Isaac's rapid-fire, highly technical orders, squads of men sprinted to the massive gantry crane and the piles of raw iron. Working with sheer, desperate adrenaline, the men violently violated every structural safety protocol in the rigging manual. First, they laid out an incredibly massive, heavy-duty steel cargo net directly beneath the crane. Inside this net, they frantically loaded over 500 tons of raw, hyper-dense iron ship ballast, massive engine blocks, and miles of thick iron anchor chain. Then, the steam crane operators pushed the towering machinist boilers past their maximum red line, violently hoisting this colossal, unimaginable weight 50 feet directly up into the howling typhoon air. But Isaac was not simply dropping a weight. He was engineering a catastrophic, highly unstable physical phenomenon known as a suspended parabolic kinetic sweep, but scaled up to an apocalyptic, weaponized level. Once the massive 500-ton payload was suspended in the air, Isaac ordered his men to attach secondary, ultra-thick braided steel mooring hawsers to the bottom of the cargo net. Using heavy mechanical dockside winches, they violently pulled the massive suspended payload hundreds of feet horizontally backward toward the shore, pulling the primary lifting cables of the crane into a terrifying, highly strained diagonal angle. They then locked the secondary tension hawsers directly to a massive, deeply rooted forged iron mooring bollard bolted into the primary concrete seawall. By pulling the suspended weight backward and locking it, the entire pier was transformed into a colossal, highly unstable loaded mechanical bowstring aiming directly down the length of the dock. The massive steel lifting cables of the gantry crane began to physically groan and vibrate, emitting a terrifying, high-pitched metallic shriek as they strained against the immense, unnatural diagonal confinement of the trapped pendulum. The entire dock was being weaponized into a macroscopic kinetic hair trigger, holding back a physical force that defied human comprehension. Isaac positioned his massive frame directly beside the primary iron mooring bollard holding the secondary tension cables. In his calloused, rust-stained hands, he held a massive sledgehammer. He looked down the rain-swept pier, the air thick with freezing sea spray and diesel exhaust. He knew the terrifying, uncompromising laws of extreme pendulum momentum and the principles of macroscopic kinetic transfer. If he shattered the locking mechanism on the mooring bollard while the massive weight of the enemy armor was driving through the center of the pier, the astronomically loaded iron payload would not simply fall straight down. It would violently, instantaneously seek physical equilibrium. The sudden release of the horizontal tension would cause the 500-ton mass of solid iron to swing forward in a massive, terrifying parabolic arc at devastating speeds. The sheer, unstoppable kinetic momentum of the swinging wrecking ball would act as a colossal mechanical scythe, cleanly sweeping entirely across the surface of the pier with millions of pounds of horizontal force, violently crushing anything caught in its path and catapulting it directly into the violent ocean below. Isaac was intentionally creating the exact catastrophic rigging nightmare that destroyed entire shipping vessels. He was building a localized apocalypse made of raw pendulum physics and solid iron. The stevedores retreated behind the thick concrete pillars of the seawall, clutching their heavy tools, holding their breath as the distant, terrifying mechanical squeal of the Japanese amphibious tanks began to echo through the storm outside. The elite predators of the Pacific War were driving blindly down the pier, completely unaware that the abandoned American dockworkers had just rewired the fundamental laws of physics to welcome them. The elite vanguard of the Japanese Special Naval Landing Forces surged down the wooden planks with the terrifying, mechanized arrogance of men who believed they were invincible. The massive amphibious assault tanks thundered forward, their heavy steel tracks violently churning the splintering wood, their main cannons sweeping the abandoned American supply crates. This was the apex predator of the naval theater, a moving column of hardened steel that had ruthlessly annihilated beachheads across the ocean. The Japanese assault infantry, armed with submachine guns and fixed bayonets, marched behind the armor, expecting to find nothing but a chaotic, disorganized slaughterhouse of terrified American laborists cowering in the rain. The deafening, relentless roar of their own massive engines and the howling typhoon completely masked the terrifying, high-pitched agonizing shriek of the highly stressed, kinetically overloaded steel cables stretched tight in the shadows directly above them. The Japanese shock troops were entirely blind to the catastrophic, physics-defying industrial trap waiting in the storm. They pushed their massive assault columns directly into the center of the pier, completely committing their immense numbers to the exact center of the kinetic kill zone. They were walking directly into the absolute heart of a colossal, highly unstable pendulum spring holding back millions of pounds of raw, unadulterated explosive kinetic tension. Out on the distant, violently pitching deck of the fleeing destroyer, the white American officers lowered their binoculars, anticipating the brutal, inevitable slaughter of their own men and the successful capture of the port. Standing in the blistering, suffocating rain at the edge of the mooring bollard, his massive chest heaving with adrenaline, First Sergeant Isaac Carter did not blink. His calloused, grease-stained hands tightened around the heavy hickory handle of the sledgehammer. He watched the massive, heavily armed wave of elite Japanese tanks push deep into the center of the pier, perfectly aligning themselves in the exact path of the suspended arc. He could see the absolute confidence in the enemy's eyes, completely unaware that a segregated blue-collar loadmaster from Brooklyn was about to violently rewrite the laws of armored combat using nothing but swinging weight. The heavily strained steel hawsers vibrating at Isaac's feet were screaming in mechanical agony, physically throwing off sparks of static discharge as the internal tension threatened to snap the iron bollard cleanly in half. Isaac knew that if he waited even 5 seconds longer, the sheer lateral pull would spontaneously rip the gantry crane directly off its tracks, completely ruining the parabolic geometry and destroying the trap. He took a deep, freezing breath of the storm-soaked air, raised the heavy iron sledgehammer high above his head, and swung it down in a devastating, blinding arc. He did not hit the enemy armor. He struck the heavy, forged iron locking pin of the mooring bollard holding back the violently suspended, hyper-dense iron payload. The deafening, sharp crack of the solid iron shattering under the extreme kinetic blow was instantly swallowed by a sound so entirely terrifying, so fundamentally unnatural, that it would haunt the nightmares of every man on that island for the rest of their lives. When 500 tons of mechanically stored kinetic potential energy are violently, instantaneously released into a swinging pendulum arc, the resulting physical reaction defies the human senses. The massive iron cargo net did not simply drop. It violently, instantaneously transitioned into a macroscopic, hyper-dense, supersonic horizontal hammer. The sheer kinetic momentum of the massive weight violently seeking equilibrium slammed downward and forward simultaneously. Within a microscopic fraction of a second, the entire center of the pier transitioned from a wooden dock into a catastrophic wave of absolute kinetic annihilation. The hyper-accelerated mass of iron ballasts swung through the howling typhoon winds, creating a concussive, deafening acoustic boom that physically knocked the hidden American stevedores off their feet. The catastrophic, unstoppable sweep of solid iron hit the fast-moving Japanese vanguard from the side with the crushing, inescapable kinetic force of a localized tidal wave made of steel. The massive overpressure and kinetic density of the swinging wrecking ball violently ruptured the hardened steel armor of the assault tanks upon contact, instantly crushing the hulls flat like tin cans. The incredible, relentless momentum of the 500-ton pendulum did not stop. It violently, physically swept the entire armored column, the shattered tanks, and the elite infantry completely off the surface of the pier. The catastrophic kinetic strike hurled the impenetrable armor through the storming air like discarded toys, violently catapulting them directly into the crushing, violently churning black depths of the typhoon swell alongside the dock. The elite assault force was instantaneously swallowed whole by a blinding, horrifying matrix of churning black water, crushing kinetic impacts, and sinking steel from the exploding pendulum strike. The immediate aftermath was not a battle. It was a completely sterilized, absolute physical erasure. The apex predators of the Pacific War, the elite, heavily armed vanguard that had terrified the entire Allied command structure into a cowardly, disorganized sacrifice, had been instantaneously wiped from the face of the earth. They had not been defeated by superior armored tactics or heavy naval artillery barrages. They had been entirely obliterated by the terrifying, invisible laws of extreme pendulum physics and kinetic transfer, weaponized by men who had been handed cargo hooks instead of combat support. The absolute silence that slowly descended upon the ruined pier was broken only by the steady, relentless howl of the typhoon winds flowing over the swaying, empty cargo net, and the heavy, freezing rain falling onto the sterilized, empty wooden planks. The 200 African-American port engineers of the 234th slowly, shakily pushed themselves up from behind the concrete seawall. They were entirely exhausted, their uniforms completely soaked in freezing saltwater, grease, and sweat, their ears ringing with a high-pitched, agonizing whine from the supersonic shockwave of the kinetic sweep. They staggered to the edge of the rain-choked, utterly destroyed main pier, gripping their heavy tools, and looked down at the absolute, unimaginable devastation they had just created. The invincible Japanese vanguard was completely gone, entirely erased beneath a towering, chaotic graveyard of churning black ocean and sunken steel. Isaac leaned heavily against the remaining iron bollard, wiping a thick layer of wet rust from his exhausted face. He looked at the young dockworkers from Chicago and Baltimore, men who had been explicitly told their entire lives that they were cowards, inherently inferior, and unfit for the rigors of combat. He watched as they stood tall in the blinding storm, realizing that they were not pack mules, and they were not disposable. They had held the absolute center of the line. They were the undisputed, absolute masters of the payload. They had survived an unwinnable war by rewriting the very physics of gravity. For 3 agonizing days, the battalion of the 234th held the ruined, storm-swept port entirely alone, surviving in the blistering winds until the heavily armed destroyers and pristine staff officers of the American command structure finally sailed back into the harbor. The admirals had not rushed to launch a desperate rescue mission. They had explicitly sacrificed the stevedores days before, fully expecting them to be slaughtered and the port to be captured. They were only arriving now because aerial reconnaissance had reported the pier was inexplicably clear of enemy armor. As the spotless, heavily armed command vessels pulled up to the catastrophically damaged seawall, the white military officers standing on the polished decks were completely paralyzed by absolute, slack-jawed incomprehension. The commanding colonel, a pristine, aristocratic man who had cowardly written the men off from the deck of his fleeing destroyer, stepped onto the wet concrete. His polished leather boots gleamed in the harsh weather, completely untouched by the mud and the blood of the infantry. He lowered his binoculars, staring down into the black water at the massive, completely destroyed Japanese armored tanks swallowed in the ocean below. And then his gaze shifted to the edge of the ruins, where 200 black dockworkers stood defiantly among the heavy chains, holding their heavy wrenches and iron marlinspikes. First Sergeant Isaac Carter stepped forward, his massive frame towering over the cowardly colonel. He offered a slow, heavy, utterly exhausted salute. "The port is secure, sir," Isaac's deep, gravelly voice echoed across the silent rain. "The enemy armor has been completely neutralized. We held the line." The commanding colonel did not return the salute. He gripped his pristine uniform coat, his eyes darting frantically from the catastrophic destruction in the water to the exhausted stevedores. In his rigidly segregated, deeply prejudiced worldview, the reality standing right in front of him was mathematically and fundamentally impossible. "You neutralize them, Sergeant?" the colonel asked, his voice dripping with cold, aristocratic disgust and heavy, undisguised condescension. "You expect me to believe that a segregated labor battalion stopped an elite amphibious vanguard without a single artillery piece?" "We used the crane, sir," Isaac replied, his jaw set like carved granite, completely refusing to back down. "We loaded the net with 500 tons of iron ballast and pulled it back under tension. When their armor hit the center of the pier, we shattered the mooring pin." The kinetic pendulum sweep knocked them cleanly into the ocean. The colonel stared at the massive loadmaster for 5 agonizing seconds, and then he let out a sharp, cruel, entirely dismissive laugh. It was a laugh born of sheer, terrifying insecurity. "Let me tell you what actually happened here, Sergeant," the colonel sneered, shaking his head and pointing a pristine, gloved finger at Isaac. "This Japanese vanguard obviously suffered a catastrophic, accidental loss due to a massive, rogue tidal wave generated by the typhoon, and the ocean simply swept them over the edge. And you and your panicked labor crew came crawling out of the warehouses after the fact to claim the glory." Isaac froze. The accusation was so profoundly vile, so entirely detached from the horrific, brilliant reality they had just survived, that for a moment, the massive sergeant could not even speak. "My men stood in this blistering storm to unload your bombs when you sat in your wardroom, and we swung our own iron to kill them when you row us off, sir," Isaac growled, his voice dropping to a dangerous, heavy rumble of pure working-class fury. We swung that net. We crushed that armor. The colonel's face flushed a violent, defensive red. The terrifying idea that a company of black laborists had outsmarted, outfought, and completely outperformed the white officers who had cold-bloodedly sacrificed them was a narrative his fragile establishment pride simply could not accept. Acknowledging their heroism would force him to explicitly acknowledge his own profound, sociopathic cowardice. The only thing I see here, Sergeant, is a massive, unauthorized destruction of critical United States military lifting equipment, the colonel snapped, pointing at the completely ruined, strained cables of the gantry crane. You intentionally sabotaged our strategic supply infrastructure because you panicked and dropped the ballast instead of fighting. The colonel turned to the heavily armed military police stepping off the destroyer. Disarm these men of their tools. Arrest First Sergeant Carter immediately. I am charging him with gross negligence, dereliction of duty, and the willful, malicious destruction of critical wartime property. The heavily armed MPs leveled their submachine guns, aiming them directly at the exhausted, sweat-soaked men who had just saved the entire Allied port. The betrayal was absolute. It was a crushing, suffocating weight that hurt infinitely more than the freezing rain or the terror of the Japanese assault. They had faced the ultimate enemy, commanded the terrifying laws of extreme pendulum momentum, and won an entirely unwinnable war. And their only reward was to be stared down by the guns of their own commanders. Their impossible, physics-defying heroism was instantly erased, stolen, and buried by the very cowardly establishment that had intentionally sacrificed them to die in the storm. This is the exact reason you will never find the name Isaac Carter or the heroes of the 234th Port Battalion in your high school history textbooks. The United States military brass entirely, aggressively sanitized the official after-action reports. The destruction of the elite Japanese vanguard was officially, falsely credited to spontaneous environmental anomalies and massive typhoon tidal surges. The 200 brave, brilliant men of the Port Battalion were quietly split up, threatened with general court-martials if they ever spoke of the true events, and shipped to other forgotten, sweltering docks to continue lifting cargo in the dark. Their unimaginable brilliance, their sheer industrial genius, was completely buried beneath mountains of redacted, classified paperwork and systemic arrogance. But the absolute truth is permanently written into the shattered concrete of that Pacific seawall. The truth lives in the calloused, grease-stained hands of the working-class men who actually bleed in the deepest, most dangerous corners of the earth, doing the heavy lifting while the cowards at the very top steal all the glory and aggressively hide the evidence. This history is your inheritance. The establishment tried to sanitize the truth just like they tried to sanitize the battlefields. They expected these men to die quietly in the rain, but they used the very tools of their oppression to completely shatter the enemy. Now, it is your turn to fight the second phase of this war, the war of memory. The algorithm of this platform is exactly like the prejudiced history books of the 20th century. It favors the comfortable, easy lie over the difficult, bleeding truth. It wants to bury this history. Do not let them. If this story made you feel a profound sense of awe, anger, or pride, you have a duty. You are now a soldier in the regiment of memory. Share this video. Send it to anyone who thinks history is only made by generals with silver stars on their shoulders. Post it on your timeline and force the world to look at the faces of the men who were intentionally sacrificed by their country and still found a way to win. And before you scroll away to the next distraction, go to the comments right now. For the men who fought the blinding storm, the crushing momentum, and the cold-blooded betrayal of their own commanders, leave a final roll call across time. Type the words, "We swing the iron." Let us build a massive wall of text in the comments that no bureaucratic cover-up, no cowardly general, and no algorithm can ever erase.